What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Danny and Bush coming at you today with our Dynasty wide receiver rankings, our top 12 Dynasty wide receivers to be specific. Yesterday or 2 days ago, we would have brought you guys our Dynasty quarterback rankings. We are celebrating the launch of our Dynasty Rankings Manifesto 2.0, complete with foundational rankings, positional, 2023 prospects, all that good stuff is available over there. Patreon.com/fantasy stock exchange. But we're giving you a little taste today, going through the top 12 Dynasty wide receivers. Some of these guys, big foundational pieces, building blocks for your team. Some of these guys, more production type of pieces for your team. So we'll definitely iron all that out once we get into it and also break down some of the wide receiver strategy. But before we do, Danny, how you doing?
Doing well. And as you guys know from watching our Dynasty content for the last 2-3 years, we love the quarterback position and we love the wide receiver position. And going through these is just a lot of fun because you're mixing, potential guys that are productive right now, aka the prime bucket, versus like the foundational market value type of leverage pieces. So going through this wide receiver position is going to be a ton of fun. As we know, it's no surprise who the top two are going to be, but kind of structuring out that 3 to 12 range was very interesting because I think you can make a bull case for any of the guys in those micro tiers being in any spot.
Yeah, exactly. So we won't spend too much time on the first two guys, but before we get into it, if you guys enjoy this video at any point, if you feel like you got some value, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new. Again, check out the Rankings Manifesto 2.0 if you're interested to see more. But before we get into it, let's hit the intro. All right, so like I teased before the intro, we are going to break down some Dynasty wide receiver strategy. As Danny also kind of talked about, quarterbacks and wide receivers, they're the foundation of your team. You can never have too many young stud wide receivers. They make very easy trade chips to be able to tier up to elite quarterbacks, to be able to go after running back production if you're ready to compete, to go after stud tight ends, whatever you're trying to do. Wide receivers are some of the more liquid assets in Dynasty because, along with draft picks and elite quarterbacks, they're always in demand.
100%. And that's why we will always preach, whether you're leaving your startup, whether you're trying to go into a rebuild, stocking up on these quarterbacks and wide receivers is going to be your best friend, obviously, other than like actual draft equity, if you will, because every single team in your league can use a quarterback, can use a receiver. So leveraging some certain packages, trying to get, different opportunity bundles from the assets you do have is going to be much easier to do so on the trade market than if you're stocking up on a ton of running backs. Because realistically, outside of maybe the top 4 to 6 teams in your league, nobody's going to be buying these, high in demand type of running backs. So stocking up quarterbacks and wide receivers, any one of the other 11 managers can flip for one at any given point. Gives you a lot of course, implied upside there, especially if, a couple of the guys on these lists we will get into, a lot of them seen a huge bump in their market value since this time last year. So if you stocked up on a bunch of these guys in the mid rounds, you are laughing in terms of the actual output you got from their market value this time last year compared to now.
Yeah, and we talk about them being the foundation of your team. In startup drafts, like you said, we want to build out these like 1 year productive struggles, fill out our running back cores in the upcoming rookie drafts, which of course in 2023, in 2024, we know that those running backs are, expected to be very good prospects. And we're seeing now starting to get into some of these 2023 guys that they are in fact good prospects. And that's the strategy that we're constantly deploying, right? We talked about last offseason with the 2022 rookie draft class that the running back position was not deep, which is why we were loading up on some of these wide receivers and why we talked about last year's Dynasty startup strategy. The optimal way to build out your startup was to trade down, collect value, get future picks, and build out your quarterback, wide receiver, and tight end position. And wide receiver is a big portion of that because I know I have a lot of rosters. I'm sure you have a lot of rosters with, 5, 6, 7 wide receivers deep of Devonta Smiths and Brandon Ayuk's and maybe some of these higher end guys like Justin Jefferson and, Jahan Dotsons and Garrett Wilsons and all these dudes that have really accumulated value in the last year.
100%. And it's funny because we're looking at it now and everything materializing in the Dynasty landscape is something that we projected forward a lot last year, where if you take these guys, you're still getting that potential accrual of value. But like we'll get into as well, your lowest opportunity cost for adding running backs when you are ready to add running backs is in fact in trading for, these low end veteran players, or as we'll get into, you're going to have your 2020, 2023, 2024 rookie drafts that you can just fill out, your whether even if it's not Bijan Robinson, your Zach Charbonnets, your Kendre Millers, your Jahmyr Gibbs, Sean Tuckers, and obviously looking towards next year, Donovan Edwards, Raheem Sanders. Like there's probably realistically now 15 plus running back prospects that are going to work their way into the top 24 of our dynasty rankings come 2024.
Yeah, exactly. So without further ado, let's get into the actual players. We are going to spend as minimal time as possible on these first two guys because I'm fairly certain you know what names we're talking about, whether it's Jefferson 1, Chase 1. You have Jefferson 1, I have Chase 1, so I'll make the argument for Chase. You make the argument for Jefferson. These dudes are the only wide receivers that we'd be comfortable giving up, 2+, maybe even 3 first-round caliber type of assets in exchange for in a trade. Ja'Marr Chase is our consensus wide receiver 1, tied with Justin Jefferson of our foundational bucket in our Dynasty Rankings manifesto. It's a complete toss-up. It's whichever one you prefer. Both guys were elite fantasy wide receivers as rookies. Both guys were elite second-year fantasy wide receivers. Both finished top 5 in points per game. Jefferson obviously has been in the league for 3 years now. He took another leap in year 3, posting a 21.7 PPR points per game season. The reason I favor Chase is pretty simple. To me, they're both elite. They're both the cream of the crop at the wide receiver position, but Chase is just over a year younger. He's 22.9 years old compared to 24 for Justin Jefferson, and he is tethered to the better quarterback in the long run with Joe Burrow. I expect if there's going to be a casualty in this situation, it'll be Tee Higgins, not Ja'Marr Chase or Joe Burrow. I expect both guys to be the locked and loaded future of the Cincinnati Bengals. If you wanted to make the argument that Jefferson is the better wide receiver in real life, I probably wouldn't disagree with you. I think he probably is, but we got 2 elite options. I'll take the better peripherals long-term when I have 2 stud talents like this.
Yeah, I don't mind this at all. I mean, realistic with Ja'Marr Chase, in year 1, you saw that like volatile, big play, down the field, a lot of touchdown type of nature from him. And when this offense really came to surface, this year, he obviously dropped a decent bit in efficiency, but he got the exact ascension we were craving. We wanted to see, okay, if his efficiency dropped, which it was always going to after how efficient he was in 2021, how is his actual volume going to see that uptick? And this was a guy that was legitimately peppered with targets every time he was healthy this year, over 20 PPR points per game when he was healthy. I do agree. I mean, I think him and Jefferson are the clear-cut, young, ascending assets while still giving you that elite production. So if you want Chase at 1, I don't mind it. But the reason why, and transitioning towards why I have Jefferson at 1, obviously tied for one of our rankings, for simplicity's sake, we will call him 2, especially going forward in the video. So we'll say wide receiver 2, even though he's tied at 1. Justin Jefferson, Minnesota Vikings. He is just phenomenal. 22.6 PPR points per game this year. Top 10 PPR point per game season of all time. And of course, we know he's still a young, ascending player. 9 games of 25 plus PPR points this year, 179 targets, over a 30% target share. I don't think anybody really needs, clarification as to why Jefferson is that elite of a player, that of elite of an asset moving forward. The thing is, it's like Minnesota Vikings, as much as we want to bag on Kirk Cousins and as, people want to, shut him out the door because he lost to the Giants, he's going to be the starting quarterback for the Vikings, at least for the next few years. And if he's the starting quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings, Adam Thielen, old, run out. We don't know the future there. KJ Osborne's a nice ancillary piece, but he's not really going to be threatening any involvement for Jefferson. And we even saw, like, once they brought in that high volume tight end TJ Hawkinson, Justin Jefferson was still by far the focal point of this offense, and kind of combats the narrative of people want to throw out too many mouths to feed, when we've seen with both these guys, Chase and Jefferson, that it doesn't really matter who's around them, they will get their volume. So the reason why I favor Jefferson is that, again, he just had an historic season. Realistically, if he, played a little bit better in the last few weeks, could have challenged for the yards mark. I mean, this is a guy that could have had 2,000 plus receiving yards. And I think he's a lock again. 120 plus receptions, maybe even 130 plus receptions, 1,700 plus receiving yards, 8 plus receiving touchdowns, each for the next 5 to 10 years. So I just love Jefferson. I know the consistency is there. I know the elite upside we saw this year is there. And I just feel a little safer than him. I don't really know if that's a tangible credit, if you will, because they're so damn good. But I just feel like if I have Jefferson in my lineup, I know that he's probably going to be the wide receiver 1 overall, next year, maybe moving forward. Whereas Chase, I feel like it's still a little bit more projection, even though, of course, when he was healthy, we did see it on display.
Yeah, I think it's just 3 seasons of data versus 2 seasons of data. I think it's pretty much the difference between the two guys. But again, we don't need to spend too much time on these dudes. You know that they're the best guys. We're splitting hairs here. Wide receiver 3 for us consensus is CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver of Danny's Dallas Cowboys. wide receiver 3 of our foundational bucket. It's rare that I actually get to talk about CeeDee Lamb because it's usually you, but it's almost better that I'm talking about him because you've been here for a while. You've had him wide receiver 3 going back to last offseason. I held back for guys like A.J. Brown, for guys like Tee Higgins, for guys like Jaylen Waddle because I just thought they were better players at the time, and Lamb had never yet shown the ability to command, a 25, 30% type of target share like we wanted to see from him. But he finished wide receiver 7 in points per game this year. He had a 28.7% target share, so he checked that box. He had 9 touchdowns. He showed the big playability. Once CeeDee Lamb was playing with his starting quarterback in Dak Prescott, he was averaging over 20 points per game in PPR leagues, only trailing Justin Jefferson after week 8 when Dak Prescott came back from the injury that he suffered in week 1. So he's still just 23.8 years old, just under the age of Justin Jefferson. When you're comparing him to our next receiver, who's 25 and a half years old, then you can definitely make the argument long-term and in the short term that those guys are neck and neck, but also, you get an extra year and a half of age or 2 years of age out of CeeDee Lamb.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty remarkable when you do look at the pace of both CeeDee Lamb and the Cowboys offense once Dak came back. I mean, I'm pretty sure in the 12 games since Dak came back, this is a guy that has had like 1,100 yards, 80 receptions, and 8 touchdowns in the 12 games he's played. So extrapolated over a full 17 game sample size, you're looking at a legitimate 120 plus or 115 plus reception, 1450 plus receiving yard, 11 receiving touchdown year. So this is exactly, if you were a big fan of CeeDee Lamb coming into the year, he was unproven coming to the year. We didn't know. We expected it. We saw the talent. We knew he was a stud player that can ascend there, but we hadn't quite seen it. And as you mentioned, he put it on full display this year. He's a clear elite wide receiver in both real life and fantasy standing, and nothing's really going to change for the next 5 to 10 years. So locking him in at wide receiver 3, I'm more than comfortable spending a top 15 overall startup pick on him.
Yeah, agreed. And we can get into another NFC East receiver who before the year I did have over CeeDee Lamb, but again, like I said, given the fact that he's, just over 2 years older than CeeDee Lamb, I can make the argument that you would take Lamb over him now.
For sure. And again, consensus wide receiver 1 of the prime bucket. Obviously, the first 3 guys were the top 3 in our foundational bucket. But A.J. Brown, wide receiver, Philadelphia Eagles, it's pretty easy to see why we would have him up here. 29% target share this year in his first year in Philly, despite sharing the field with another elite young wide receiver that we'll get into with Devonta Smith. And a guy like Dallas Goedert at the tight end position didn't really matter. Again, this too many mouths to feed narrative did not matter for an elite talent like it usually never does. A.J. Brown is a player in his first few years in Tennessee where we saw when he was healthy this level of game-breaking ability. But unfortunate part was he would always miss, a few games. We never really saw it materialize. People were having question marks about his durability. And then this year, lands in Philly, traded for that first-round pick for Treylon Burks, and just absolutely blows up. Him and CeeDee Lamb pretty much had almost identical seasons from a point-per-game standpoint. Obviously, CeeDee Lamb getting more receptions, A.J. Brown more big plays, more touchdowns. But the big difference here and why we have Lamb over Brown, as you mentioned, is that little discrepancy in age. If these guys were the same age, I think they would literally be 3A and 3B, if you will. He's tethered to the elite offense, great young MVP quarterback candidate, and an elite coaching staff. I think for the next, again, 5 to 10 years, even though he's, technically in the prime bucket, he's still going to be a very, very valuable piece for your dynasty teams for the foreseeable future. So, JJ, Chase, Lamb, I think he's the clear cut wide receiver 4 after those guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can move on to another guy, a young receiver that had a big time ascension last year, a little bit of a fall since then, but Tee Higgins, wide receiver from the Cincinnati Bengals, consensus wide receiver 4 of our foundational bucket. He's great. Obviously, he's probably the best wide receiver 2 in the NFL. If you look across all the rosters, who's got the best duo of wide receivers? To me, it's still Chase and Higgins. He posted at least 10 plus 10.7 PPR points per game in 11 of his 13 healthy games this season. So just the model of consistency, consistently getting, 6 to 10 targets a game. His wide receiver 26 finish this year in points per game is largely skewed by 2 games where he was active but did not record a catch. And then another game against Buffalo, which obviously was canceled after the first quarter for Damar Hamlin's situation. The one question mark that I have for Tee Higgins is his contract situation long-term, because like I said with Chase, I think if there's going to be a cap casualty that they can't afford to pay, they might trade Tee Higgins this offseason because, Tee Higgins is up for his extension. You have Joe Burrow coming up for a mega $50+ million extension that he's going to get. Jamar Chase a year from now is probably going to command a $25, potentially $30 million contract himself. Do you lock in that much cap space to 3 players? I think they should personally, but we don't know how this team is going to operate. They might opt to do what Tennessee did and trade him away for a first round pick. try and draft a guy to replace him in the draft. And even if he leaves the situation, the one thing that we have to lean on with Tee Higgins is that he presumably goes to a place that doesn't have Jamar Chase there or somebody of that caliber. So we know that his target share would probably go up if he went to a new situation. But is he better off in Cincinnati? So that's really the only question mark with Tee Higgins, which is probably why you favor the guy that we're going to talk about in a second over a guy like Tee Higgins. But he's still a great player. He's still in a good situation, at least in the short term, and probably in the long term as well. But we do have those concerns.
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually, I still have Tee Higgins as my wide receiver 5. I get there is some risk there, but as you said, I mean, the most logical option would be building around the 3 players that basically turned around the Cincinnati franchise. You're talking about Joe Burrow, Tee Higgins, and Jamar Chase. They are easily, in my opinion, the best quarterback and 2 wide receivers in terms of chemistry in the entire NFL. You can make the argument that AJ Brown, Jalen Hurts, and Devonta Smith are up there as well, but for my money, like, Tee Higgins, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase fit like, 3 peas in a pod, if you will. With Tee Higgins, anytime he was healthy this year, playing 50+% of the snaps, you're looking at a legitimate game-breaking type of wide receiver. And that's what I keep clinging to here. 23.4% target share in that sample size, 2.21 yards per team pass attempt, 34.9% air yard share, and 17.9 fantasy points per game. Well, I just mentioned with AJ Brown, he averaged 17.6 PPR points per game on the season. So in terms of pure production, when Tee Higgins is healthy, he is right neck and neck there with CeeDee Lamb, with AJ Brown, in terms of the middle of the wide receiver 1 territory. And again, as I mentioned, I think he's going to sign an extension here. Doesn't really matter if he's quote unquote playing second fiddle to Jamar Chase. He still gets, again, over 23% of the team targets. So we like the efficiency of this offense. We like that he's still gaining targets. And obviously, at any given point, there's a potential chance he has a 10, 12, maybe plus touchdown output, throwing or catching passes from a quarterback that might throw for 40, 45 in a year.
Yeah, exactly. So we actually have Tee Higgins kind of like intermingled in this like mini tier of 3 receivers. And I'll let you get into the next guy that we have who doesn't have the draft capital these first 2 guys have, but has absolutely been there from a production standpoint.
Yeah, and I think if he didn't have more question marks with this profile, I think you can argue this guy up at wide receiver 3 just solely based off the production he's shown in his first 2 years. Amon Ra St. Brown, wide receiver of the Detroit Lions, consensus tied for wide receiver 4 in our foundational bracket, obviously tied with both Tee Higgins and the next guy we will talk about. But when he played in, again, 50+% of the snaps this past season, 19.2 PPR points per game. Elite figure, just up there with a guy like Stephon Diggs. So when he is on the field and when he is fully healthy, he is a legitimate game changer at the wide receiver position. 130 targets and 10 targets per game in that stretch, including 1,090 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns. He's still only 23 years old. Obviously, we know he's a clear alpha target earner, and this Detroit offense has really proven many people wrong here. But of course, the problem what I have in terms of ranking him, ahead of a guy like Tee Higgins, ahead of a guy like CeeDee Lamb, ahead of a guy like AJ Brown, is that I don't necessarily think the market's going to value him, even if he continues what he's been doing amongst the likes of those guys. I still feel like, you'll have market discrepancies between them due to the fear of, Jameson Williams or, Amon Ra St. Brown's good, but is he just a slot dominant player? Is he really that level of talent? Those question marks, for better or worse, are always going to be ringing in a lot of the dynasty managers' minds. So as a result, I don't think he's got a wide receiver 3 overall in dynasty level ceiling that maybe a Tee Higgins, maybe a Jaylen Waddle, like we'll get into, maybe even some of those rookie guys that we'll get into do have in their range of outcomes. However, if you're trying to pick a guy that you want to keep on your team, that's still going to hold a lot of value, that's still going to have a wide receiver 1 level ceiling, like Amon Ra St. Brown, if he had a wide receiver 3 PPR point per game ceiling next year, I would not be shocked. So when it comes to him, the production's there. That production value is obviously something that we crave, but unfortunately, given the market, circumstances, if you will, you got to look at that volatility and factor it in your rankings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair take of why you would have him ranked ahead of him. I actually do have Amon Ra St. Brown rated ahead of Tee Higgins. He is my wide receiver 6, and Tee Higgins is my wide receiver 7. I realize that the market probably would prefer Tee Higgins, but like that's why we do rankings, in my opinion, is to recognize market inefficiencies. If 100%. People do value Tee Higgins maybe as like a tier above Amon Ra St. Brown, then you should down tier from Tee Higgins and collect, a second round pick on top of Amon Ra St. Brown in return. So that's kind of the discrepancy between the two of us. You covered pretty much everything that I was thinking, though. So we can probably move on to the next guy in Jaylen Waddle, who, again, is tied for our wide receiver 4 of our foundational bucket. We kind of have these guys intermingled between 5 and 7 between the two of us in our rankings. Waddle's the same type of discussion that we have with Higgins, right? Some uncertainty regarding situational factors, like with Tyreek Hill being there and, Tua Tagovailoa's long-term health because he had a bunch of concussions this year. And, Tyreek gobbling up 30% of the targets isn't ideal for Jaylen Waddle. But what we do know about him is that he has 2 top 15 finishes in his first 2 seasons, which is pretty insane. And on top of that, he's shown them in different ways, right? We saw the target earning ability his rookie season with 142 targets, 9.8 yards per reception, like Jarvis Landry type of role. And then being a big play threat this year with only 116 targets, but 18.1 yards per reception. So we've seen him do it as a short and intermediate type of guy, and as a deep threat, and as a guy that's going to obviously break off these slant routes to the house like we've seen from him so far this year. I think he's a superstar talent, and that's really all that matters when you're like a 24-year-old wide receiver who's already producing at a high level for fantasy. We don't know quarterback situation. We don't know how long Tyreek's going to be there, but all I do know is that, Waddle, along with Tee Higgins, are some of the best number 2 receivers in the league.
Yeah, and again, the funny thing here, obviously, they're all tied because the only reason why I have Tee Higgins at 5, you have him at 7, you have Jaylen Waddle at 5, I have him at 7. Again, this is their own sub tier. All these guys are phenomenal players, to be discussed amongst each other. The reason why I personally would prefer the other two is just simply due to volume, because we did see comparatively that those guys just command more volume when they're on the field. Again, the flip side of that, Jaylen Waddle, what he's doing on his volume is arguably the most efficient wide receiver in the league. So if we do see him, ascend to that area that Tee Higgins and Amon Ra St. Brown are in terms of target earning ability, he absolutely could be, the wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 on the market. However, I just feel like the volume bets of the other two, personally, feel more safe for me right now. I still think, of course, Jaylen Waddle, phenomenal talent, but Tyreek Hill obviously commanding, 33% or 34, whatever. I think it's like 33 or 34% of the targets that Tyreek Hill commanded this year, which is just absolutely crazy. Lands in Miami in his first year and commands that level of target share. However, again, he has the ability to score on any single goddamn touch. So he's obviously going to be amongst us here. I just prefer the volume of the other guys, even if I rambled on a little bit here.
Yeah, and obviously the reason we don't have Hill this high yet is because
Age.
you guys know our strategy, right? You know our strategy of drafting young foundational wide receivers. And as much as, Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs are going to really, really help your fantasy teams, you got to draft those guys at a point in your draft that you're automatically switching from, a flexible start to your draft to a win now start to your draft. And you have to draft Tyreek Hill, in the second or third round of a dynasty startup. And to me, I'm just frankly not going to do that because I can stay flexible for 4 or 5 rounds and then decide at that point in time whether or not I want to compete, still get, solid wide receiver production out of guys like Mike Evans and Keenan Allen, some of these other later on, older wide receivers. Then of course I can load up on running backs if I wanted to go for a more competitive style team. And that's why we have guys like the next 3 that we're going to talk about who are all rookies this past year. And Garrett Wilson, the first one, I'll let you take it away with him, wide receiver for the New York Jets.
Yeah, what a rookie season. That was absolutely ludicrous what he was able to do here. We're talking about a 24.9% target share as a freaking rookie. Absolutely insane. Top 24 wide receiver as a rookie, again, despite dealing with inadequate quarterback play over there in New York. However, as we know, the Jets are rumored to be one of the absolute hot spots of a quarterback this offseason. It's almost a foregone conclusion that whether it's Lamar Jackson, Derek Carr, Jimmy Garoppolo, some, top 20-ish plus level quarterback, or in Lamar's case, top 5 to 8 level quarterback is going to be landing in New York. And you're getting a young, budding superstar talent like Garrett Wilson. You guys already know we already buy into talent over situation. He showed, again, almost a 25% target share, top 24 wide receiver in his first year, that he is indeed that level of talent to be able to command wide receiver 1 volume. But now he's got the chance to vastly improve his situation. He probably goes realistically from, a top 20-ish, top 15-ish level redraft pick to, if he got like a Lamar Jackson plus quarterback, he'd be a top 10 wide receiver probably in redraft leagues, maybe top 12 in terms of ADP. So getting that level of player, getting that level of potential situational uptick for immediate production, all of that boding into a guy that I genuinely believe this time next year has an opportunity to be the wide receiver 3 overall in Dynasty.
Yeah. Still a very young player, showed quite a bit. He had a great prospect profile. He comes out, and even though some people faded him because he went to the Jets, and we were definitely not one of them, and I feel very good knowing that I got a lot of Garrett Wilson in drafts because people did fade him because he went to the Jets. They already have Elijah Moore. Zach Wilson's throwing him the ball. We know what the narratives were. And Garrett Wilson absolutely showed why that stuff doesn't matter if you're a great wide receiver. He outproduced Elijah Moore. He showed that whatever quarterback was back there, whether it was Flacco, Zach Wilson, or Mike White, he had at least one 100-yard game with all three of those guys, which is pretty insane as well. And when Garrett Wilson, I talked about this in the rookie video, when he had a Jets quarterback have a passer rating of above 90, whatever quarterback it was, because Zach Wilson had games like that, Mike White had games like that, and Joe Flacco had games like that, he averaged 18 PPR points per game. So you give this guy, a Derek Carr level quarterback, even if it's somebody like that or Jimmy Garoppolo, he absolutely can be a top 5, top 8 redraft wide receiver next year as a second-year guy. And like you said, probably ascend to a top 3 dynasty wide receiver if that happens.
This Garrett Wilson, I know this is going to be spicy because, he's still a young player, 22 years old, but there's a realistic chance that we're looking at like a young Stephon Diggs here, the way he played this year. And if he gets that quarterback upgrade, I would not be shocked. Second year, we're looking at a guy who has 100+ receptions, 1,400+ yards. That's the level of player we're dealing with.
Yeah, exactly. And I can transition right into the guy that was picked 2 picks before him. In the actual NFL draft, Drake London, wide receiver of the Atlanta Falcons, consensus wide receiver 8 of our foundational bucket. We are, and specifically me, I'm a lot higher than the market on Drake London because when you look at his peripherals, they don't get much better as a rookie season. We're talking about a guy to command 29.4% of his team's targets, 32.4% targets per route run, which was second among all wide receivers, not just rookies, among all wide receivers. I believe Tyreek Hill was the only one that was higher. We're talking about a guy who led all rookies in target share, targets per route, was top 3 in yards per route run among rookies. He was second in PFF receiving grade among rookies behind Garrett Wilson with 85.3 PFF receiving grade. The reason he only posted a 10.5 PPR points per game stat line is because he played for a team that threw under 25 pass attempts, which also with the Chicago Bears this year is the first time that's happened since the 2005 Steelers. So we're talking about a team that barely threw the ball. They're probably going to make a quarterback upgrade. And even if we get Desmond Ridder, we saw what Desmond Ridder meant for Drake London's fantasy value down the stretch of the season. He's an absolute stud, and he's available for like good wide receiver prices. You don't have to pay stud wide receiver prices for Drake London right now. And he absolutely had, like a stud caliber rookie season. If he was on a team like, the Jets were even this year with the amount of pass attempts they had, or a team like, Odell Beckham Jr. was on in 2014 with the New York Giants, he posted the same peripherals that Odell Beckham Jr. posted as a rookie, like 30% target share, 32% targets per route run, 85+ PFF receiving grade. All that was there for Drake London. The only thing was we didn't get the pass attempts. And I know Kyle Pitts was out for a couple weeks, but to be honest, it's the Amon Ra and Hawkinson thing all over again. I'd rather see you produce when the player is out rather than, you not produce even though that they're out.
Yeah, I mean, if we, dial it back from a situational comparison standpoint, and we realize that quite literally, like you mentioned, the Atlanta Falcons were operating at an archaic rate in terms of being able to pass the ball. Legitimately one of 2 teams, Chicago and them, under 25 pass attempts per game. I believe only 7 teams in the NFL attempted under 30. So like we're legitimately looking at like a legitimate complete outlier of volume here. And yet the peripherals are just absolutely magnificent. You mentioned 30+% target share, PFF grade, all that fun stuff for Drake London. I'm really excited to see how this offense looks next year. Kyle Pitts fully healthy, Drake London entering the second year, and whether it's Desmond Ridder or potentially a quarterback upgrade, maybe a Ryan Tannehill gets traded.
I hope it's Tannehill, man. I think Tannehill would be perfect for that offense. We know what he can do in Arthur Smith's system. We've seen it already, and Drake London would just be his new A.J. Brown, and Kyle Pitts would be his new, but like on crack, Jonnu Smith plus probably
Delaney
a
Walker.
lot of other better tight ends. And that would be really fun to see. So I hope they get at least like a Ryan Tannehill caliber prospect or a player to play quarterback there. And whether it's Tannehill, whether it's Ridder, whether it's somebody else, maybe they draft somebody with their, top 10 draft pick that they have. I still think they're in a good spot. And I do think Drake London's situation's only going up from here. And if you dig into the peripherals, it's enough to make you buy in completely.
Yeah, 100%. I do think, though, obviously we mentioned Garrett Wilson, Drake London, and transitioning to the next guy we'll talk about, all phenomenal young rookie seasons. Chris Olave, wide receiver of the New Orleans Saints. Some people might even be wondering how we haven't even talked about him yet because he's been that level of player in his rookie season. Tied for wide receiver 8 in our foundational bucket. Me and you basically just have him and London flipped, which, I mean, is an argument. Like both of them are talented. Both of them are phenomenal. Great peripherals. And when we talk about Chris Olave, obviously the second of the Ohio State wide receivers, which is pretty ridiculous to think about. We're going to have another one this year, by the way. 26.7% target share, 29.6% target rate. So, well, quite not, Drake London, top 3 overall in the league type of volume. Still fantastic, elite rookie year volume from the receiver. Over 13 PPR points per game as a rookie, even outproduced Garrett Wilson from a point per game perspective. Ranked as a top 20 overall wide receiver in points per game. It just, it's just bright from him. The only real, concern here compared to him and maybe Drake London and Garrett Wilson is that he doesn't quite have that quarterback path to upgrading where realistically with the Saints, they don't have draft capital, don't have a lot of money. There's not really an applicable path, if you will, for them getting, a top 20 level quarterback, a Tannehill, a Carr, guy like that. But I mean, when we're looking at the talent, and as we always do, valuing talent over situation, Chris Olave could be a 30+% target share receiver as soon as next year and have a 100 catch, 1,300 yard, 8+ touchdown level second season.
Yeah, and I think it's crazy to say that of these 3 rookies, he actually had the best quarterback play of the 3, which is why he was the highest producing fantasy rookie this year.
Yep.
Because Andy Dalton, for what it's worth, still graded out as like a top 15 PFF quarterback. He was
Crazy.
fine. He was honestly like on par with what you can probably expect out of a Derek Carr with the Jets next year, if that's where he goes, and out of a Ryan Tannehill to the Falcons, if that's where they go. So yeah. I think what we got out of Andy Dalton is like that caliber of quarterback play for Chris Olave. And to me, given that Drake London's like a year younger than him, he's the youngest receiver in the NFL, and he did that in such a bad situation. I have more faith that if the situations were neutral, if we had Dalton thrown to both guys, that Drake London would have outproduced him. And of course, you guys know I had Drake London as my wide receiver 1 entering the season from this rookie class. And I think I also had Garrett Wilson ahead of him too. So that's kind of why I still lean those guys over Chris Olave, but nothing to take away. He's still a top 10 receiver for me. He's still a great dynasty asset to have. I just prefer London and Garrett Wilson.
100%. And I just want to quickly make preface to this. It's pretty remarkable that nobody's talking about Chris Olave as potentially the offensive rookie of the year. Like everybody's saying Garrett Wilson, maybe somebody will throw in a Kenneth Walker, but if we're just looking at the output this year, like Chris Olave was more productive than both of them. So the fact that his odds to win rookie of the year are like what, plus 2,000, plus 2,500 is pretty insane to me.
Yeah, it is pretty crazy. I think it's because, it's part of its market too, because the Seahawks were actually a good team. They made the playoffs. The Jets are the Jets. They play in New York. It could be part of that. New Orleans, not necessarily because they weren't a good team and because they aren't a big market. That could be why. But yeah, for the most part, on paper, it looks like Olave had the better rookie season than Garrett Wilson. So we can move on to another prime receiver, the last of the aging wide receivers, let's call them, because pretty much everybody in this top 12 is young. We don't have any of those Tyreek, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Cooper Kupps in here for the reason that I kind of outlined. When we're in a startup, we're looking for flexibility in the early rounds. And to me, that means grabbing these foundational wide receivers. Of course, at face value, it's very difficult to determine, should I take Garrett Wilson here or should I take Tyreek Hill here? Because they accomplish different goals, right? Like one accomplishes you winning a fantasy championship in your first year, if that's what you're looking to do, because maybe you drafted, I don't know, Christian McCaffrey in the second round and you get to the third round and Tyreek Hill's on the board and you want to draft him. That's fine. But for me, the way I draft, I like to stay flexible and make my determination as late in a startup draft as possible, which is why I favor those foundational guys. And another guy here, DK Metcalf, consensus wide receiver 2 of the prime bucket, just over 25 years old. Feels good to be on the right side of the DK Metcalf discussions this time last year because many of, a lot of people were not excited about DK Metcalf. It didn't play out exactly as we thought it would because we were taking DK Metcalf again. We were just betting on the talent. That's what we usually do. And hoping that, maybe he'd have a wide receiver 2 caliber season, which he did this year at wide receiver 24 in points per game. But we thought, they'd be picking high. They're going to draft a Bryce Young. They're going to draft a CJ Stroud. And technically that's still in play because they have Denver's pick and it's very high. But they're probably going to stick with Geno Smith. And I think either way you slice it, it played out in a way that DK Metcalf has a capable quarterback, whether it's Geno Smith or whether they do move on from him and go after a young quarterback. So I really just, I'm betting on the talent again with DK Metcalf. He's a guy that is still a young receiver. He's still got probably 5+ years of great production left. He's still a freak athlete. He can still give you those big, long touchdowns. He can still give you those red zone touchdowns, all the things that he's been doing his entire career with, 25+% of the Seahawks targets. And now we have Tyler Lockett getting older. He didn't really show any signs of decline, but there's a good chance that DK Metcalf maybe even has more targets going forward.
Yeah, and that's going to be probably the biggest dilemma of, DK Metcalf of the Seahawks this offseason is whether they bring back Geno, maybe, I think a probably market value realistically would be like a 3-year, $90 million deal, 30 APY, just under the Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr type of range. Feels like pretty fair for both sides. They might do something like that, or like you mentioned, they might just take a rookie quarterback, which either way, we know that DK Metcalf's going to have insulation with the market because he's at least going to have, a top 20-ish level or top 15 plus level quarterback with Geno, or he's going to have a young ascending, Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, worst case, probably like Will Levis at quarterback. So with DK Metcalf, we know he's an elite talent. We know that the production hasn't really been as comparable the last 2 years compared to what it was, 2020, 2019. But in any given year, if you have that consistency week to week, if he's not dealing with, a patella, well, what even happened to his patella against the Chiefs? He literally dislocated his patella.
Yeah, he had an injury that a lot of people assumed was like a season ender, right? Like I remember there was, the guy on the rooftop drinking the bleach and whatever, like that meme when Breece Hall and DK Metcalf went down that week. Everybody assumed they were both season enders, and DK Metcalf ended up playing through it because, again, he's just a freak of nature. Like he's just not a human being. So, DK Metcalf playing through injury this year, playing through injury in 2021, dealing with, Russell Wilson in 2021, who didn't play that well. And we now know it might have been Russell Wilson and not necessarily, the offensive scheme there in Seattle. So a lot of things have gone wrong for DK Metcalf is the underlying point. But regardless, we know DK Metcalf is an elite talent. We know he's been able to survive these situations altogether. And we are going to get into the final guy of the video, which is Devonta Smith, wide receiver, also of the Philadelphia Eagles. We talked about his teammate earlier, and he's a guy who finds himself a big-time riser from a guy that people were casting aside as like the 25th best wide receiver in Dynasty this time last year.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty remarkable. Also, side note, it's a pretty, some comedic value here that you're covering the one Cowboys wide receiver and I'm covering the 2 Eagles wide receivers. But I mean, all jokes aside, Devonta Smith, wide receiver 10 in our foundational bucket. It's remarkable what he was able to do as a second-year wide receiver, sharing the field with A.J. Brown, who we already mentioned was a 29% target share player. Devonta Smith had a 27% target share. Between those 2 wide receivers, they accounted for 56% of the Eagles' targets, which is just a ridiculously mind-boggling stat. Complete elite usage from both of them. He's proven that, maybe outside of Jaylen Waddle and Tee Higgins, he's probably the 3rd best wide receiver 2 in the entirety of the NFL. Top 10 in wide receiver production in fantasy this year, despite being ranked outside of the top 25 Dynasty wide receivers. Again, still only 24 years old, same situational advantages of A.J. Brown. Clear top 12 wide receiver in Dynasty in mine and your opinions.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody overthought him because A.J. Brown was there. Again, too many mouths to feed is the stalest narrative in fantasy, and we've kind of been pushing against that. 2 years ago with Tee Higgins, when Jamar Chase came in, last year with Devonta Smith, when A.J. Brown came in, and we're kind of just seeing it play out year over year. When teams have 2 great wide receivers, they concentrate their passing games. We saw it in Miami. We saw it in Cincinnati. We saw it in Philadelphia. We've seen it in Tampa Bay. We've seen it in like plenty of locations before, and I think it's going to continue. So that is the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Check out Underdog Fantasy. Check out the Patreon for all of our Dynasty rankings, quarterbacks, wide receivers, tight ends, bucketed, 2023 prospects, all available over there. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.
Why you need the money?